Which pharaoh appears in films the most often? The short answer is Cleopatra VII. There's like 100 versions of her story. But what about the earlier ones, your New Kingdom pharaohs and so forth? The obvious answer might seem to be Ramesses II or Ramesses the Great. Surprisingly though, he's actually beaten by his own father. King Seti I has more appearances in modern Hollywood films than any other pharaoh, with the exception of Cleopatra. We're going to look at 4 films: The Ten Commandments from 1956, The Prince of Egypt from 1998, The Mummy from 1999, and Exodus, Gods and Kings from 2014. These 4 films cover a huge period of time and mark distinctive phases in Hollywood depictions of ancient Egypt. Today, I would like to explore those through the figure of Seti I. To set the scene historically, Seti I came to power around 1300 BCE. He ruled Egypt for about 10 years, give or take, and he's noteworthy for establishing the 19th dynasty on proper footing. His father, Ramesses I, is officially recognized as the first ruler of that dynasty, but Seti is the one who reigned for a proper chunk of time and really set the tone of that lineage. His son, Ramesses II, is far more famous than Seti, and ruled for nearly 70 years, leaving a massive impact on government, art, social, and economic history. But for my money, Seti I is an underappreciated pharaoh in Egyptian history, and as we'll see in these films, he's quite a pivotal figure in the tale of Ramesses II.
Let your own image proclaim my loyalty for 1,000 years. Superb!
Okay, first movie, The Ten Commandments. This was directed by Cecil B. DeMille and released in 1956. It's actually a remake of a film that he made about 30 years earlier, which was released in 1923. That earlier version of The Ten Commandments was mostly a morality play about modern life, but it included a short prologue about the ancient Egyptian part of the story. This 1956 film is basically that prologue really stretched out to a 3.5-hour epic. Obviously, The Ten Commandments is one of the great films in Hollywood's swords and sandals genre. I'm not going to critique the whole film, we're going to focus on Seti I, but we'll get a chance to discuss some of the background details and how they actually fit in with what we know of this period. It is an impressive work, so let's watch. Film starts with a really long overture and a declaration by the director as to the importance of this story. Bear in mind, this was the 1950s in the United States, a time of incredible social and religious conservatism, so this was very much aimed at that crowd, trying to give them a sense of the importance of the biblical tale. We go through an extended prologue with the finding of the baby Moses in the reeds, all classic stuff from the Book of Exodus. So we first meet Seti I about 18 minutes into the film. And a couple of things to note about this scene is, first of all, the amazing costuming. The film was released just 30 years after the tomb of Tutankhamun had been discovered, and about 20 years after the excavation and clearance of that tomb was finally finished. As a result, the creators of this film had really good access to up-to-date information about clothing and costuming, and they use that to create these absolutely lavish outfits. Seti is portrayed by an actor named Sir Cedric Hardwicke, and he kind of presents a kindly old man version of Seti. He's stern, and his interactions with Ramesses give you the sense that he's holding on to power strongly, and he doesn't fully trust his son or his intentions. But this whole depiction of the costuming scene, Seti putting on his jewelry, it's not strictly accurate to what the ancients would have worn, but it's a really good version for 1950s Hollywood. The crown is quite fancy too. I like the little band of cobras that go around it. And Seti taking up his ornaments like his crook and his flail. You could imagine this is not too far off the imagery of an actual pharaoh. So now we have the presentation of tribute from the rulers of Ethiopia. In actual ancient Egyptian terms, these would be the rulers of Punt, who come from the area roughly around modern Somalia. The whole context of a tribute scene, a presentation of gifts from foreign lands, That is 100% in line with ancient Egyptian art, and we see it in tombs and temples all the time. If you want to know about the people of Punt, they are most famously depicted on Hatshepsut's temple in Deir el-Bahri. One thing to note about the sets, around 22 minutes and 30 seconds, we get a nice background shot of the columns, and they actually include the cartouche of Seti I, which, although it's in the background, actually seems to be accurate to the proper version. Again, Seti appears as kind of a stern, aloof figure. He's not particularly welcoming to the Ethiopians, and he's clearly in a position of superiority. That might not be too far off how these presentation scenes would go. So now we have the presentation itself, and holy crap, this is Hollywood spectacle on a really impressive scale. You have people coming forth, bringing individual gifts, which they display, and then they pull back to allow the next people to come forth, considering temple and tomb art, which very much shows this kind of procession of people approaching, each one carrying a distinctive gift. So the next time we see Seti properly, he's playing a board game with his daughter. The game he's playing is Jackals and Canines, which actually is a game that has been found in ancient Egyptian tombs. We don't know the rules exactly, of course, but it is an actual item, so kudos to the production design for making that. The depiction of Seti here, his indifference to the problem of the slaves, kind of goes with the general characterization of the king as a sort of kindly old man who's largely indifferent to the exploitation that the system he commands actually involves. Bearing in mind the fact that ancient Egyptian pharaohs almost never talk about slavery except in the context of taking prisoners, we don't know if that matches up with Seti's actual personality. But from Seti's actual historical inscriptions, we do know that he put a lot of effort and resources into the support and maintenance of his workforce. The king left inscriptions at sites like Jebel el-Silsila, where he describes the quarrying of stone for building projects, and he specifically mentions that he provides everything that the workers needed in order to do their jobs properly. So, at least by his own description, he wasn't an indifferent ruler. He did genuinely care about providing what was needed in order to get the job done. Another thing to note about Hardwicke here, the actor, is that he's in his mid-60s when this was filmed. So he's about 20 years too old for Seti, who probably died in his early to mid-40s, give or take. We have the king's mummy, which is now in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, and every forensic study of that body says that he was approximately 45 when he died. So this version of Seti is actually a little bit too old. But Hardwicke looks pretty good for his age here, and he certainly has some similarity with the actual Seti, including that very prominent nose and those strong jawline and cheekbones. It's actually not a bad depiction of the king. We gotta give a shout out to Yul Brynner as Ramesses. First of all, he walks with such swagger. You get a sense that he really is a man who has been groomed for power from an early age, and the actor just carries that effortlessly. But also the costuming, he is just dripping with style. He comes in wearing a full-on blue cape. Now, blue was an expensive dye, so that's showing wealth, but also he's just incredibly flamboyant in the way that old Hollywood epics really liked to do. It's genuinely amazing. Capes should make a comeback. They're just so stylish. This next scene doesn't really have anything to do with Seti himself, but I do want to give a shout out. It's a really impressive depiction of raising an obelisk. Now, the ancient Egyptians did not leave any art or texts describing how to raise an obelisk specifically, but archaeologists and engineers have done experiments with blocks of similar size, and they figured out that one of the most likely methods was exactly what you see here. Not the flag waving or the enormous winches or anything, but you bring the obelisk up a ramp to the place where it is supposed to go. You then slowly tilt the obelisk inwards until it finally catches on the pedestal down below. You use ropes to guide it and control it at every step of the process, and once it stands fully, the weight keeps it upright. This depiction is pretty on point with what Egyptological science suggested in the 1950s, and to this day, it's still a fairly good hypothesis for how the monuments were raised. Talking about Seti more specifically now, they do include a nice reference to the king having a victory at Kadesh. Now, you might associate the Battle of Kadesh specifically with Ramesses II, but there were actually several battles around Kadesh during earlier generations, and Seti did lead an attack on this city and apparently conquered it. So the reference to his victory is right in line with the historical inscriptions. The next time we see Seti, he's talking with Ramesses, and at this point the plot is in full motion. Ramesses is trying to poison Seti against Moses, because Ramesses is afraid that Moses is more popular and more powerful than him, and is more likely to take up the throne. In this scene, Seti basically shows himself to be kind of weak-minded, in the sense that he is swayed by Ramesses and poisoned against Moses. It's not direct and it's not immediate, but it definitely sets in motion the chain of events that will allow Seti to exile Moses in order to send him to distant lands. It gives a slightly weaker, more indecisive vision of Seti than I think we should necessarily take from the king's actual life. But, creative liberty, the story has to unfold, so it's not the worst choice in the world. At this point, Moses' Hebrew story kicks into gear, and we don't actually see Seti again for about 40 minutes or so. The next time we catch up with him, we're back in the palace, in the same hall where the tribute scene happened earlier. A couple of things to mention here. Firstly, in movies, Egyptian palaces are often shown as being stone, with giant blocks everywhere. That's not strictly accurate, because ancient Egyptian palaces were mostly mud brick. They would use stone for important parts, like the base of a column, or the lintels and door jambs in an entranceway. But for the most part, the palaces were actually more temporary architecture. Stone was reserved for temples and tombs, which was more eternal. So we now see Seti enthroned, along with the princess and Ramesses strolling around in the background. Ramesses' armor is pretty magnificent, and I'm going to talk about that a lot more during the Battle of Kadesh, when we eventually get to it on the podcast. But another thing I want to mention is that in the background, we have these bodyguards who are wearing horned helmets and carrying round shields. That's actually historical. These are what we know as the Sherdan. They're one of the sea peoples who appear in the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Ramesses II includes these warriors in his art at the Battle of Kadesh, and he describes them in his historical inscriptions. Ramesses seems to have used the Sherdan as a kind of bodyguard or special detachment in his army. So having them here in Seti's throne room with their distinctive horned helmets and round shields is a really nice attention to detail on the part of the filmmakers. You really get a sense that they did study inscriptions and art in order to populate their scenes. So credit where credit is due. We also get a scene of dancing. That's actually a pretty good depiction, which is based on tomb art and iconography. The dancers did make movements like this, kind of acrobatic in a choreographed sense. So again, shout out to the makers. At this point, Seti exiles Moses. His mind has been poisoned, Moses has committed a crime, and he must be banished from the kingdom. Which brings us to the end of Seti's involvement in the Ten Commandments. Overall, I think it's actually a pretty good depiction of the king. The actor, Cedric Hardwicke, is a decent likeness for Seti, particularly in the nose and the jawline. The characterization of him as a sort of kindly old man who's also indifferent to the suffering and exploitation of the system, that is more in line with the biblical tradition than what we actually know from Seti's inscriptions. Granted, these were pharaohs, they were monarchs, so they weren't exactly the nicest people in the world, and the society that they oversaw was a staggeringly unequal one, even by modern standards. But leaving that aside and just looking at the film on its own merits, the depiction of Seti is actually pretty solid. He's not over the top in a mustache-twirly kind of villain role. He's quite believable as an older man who is comfortable in power and sees no reason to change the system that benefits him. He might be considered a little bit weak-minded in the way Ramesses poisons him against Moses, but again, that is part of the biblical tradition in the sense of the story has to unfold in a specific way, and you have to get Seti to a position where he can exile his own son, or at least adopted son. So overall, I would actually give this depiction of Seti a reasonably high grade, about 8 out of 10. You can quibble with a couple of historical details, but overall, it's pretty solid.